The cold was a constant, a familiar ache in the bones of soul that Kwon Ji-hoon had long ago mistaken for strength. It seeped through the tailored wool of his overcoat, a ghost at the feast of his life. From his vantage point on the third-floor balcony of the Shinsky department store, the Christmas shoppers below were a frantic, colorful tide of humanity, their laughter and chatter a language he no longer spoke. For years since he'd felt anything resembling the warmth they seemed to exude so effortlessly. He was here for a perfunctory act of generosity, a diamond necklace for a business associate's wife, a transaction meant to look like a gift. The velvet box in his pocket felt like a stone. Everything felt like a stone. His life was a fortress built of them, and he, its lonely king. Then he saw her. The world, with all its noise and motion, simply stopped. It was as if a cinematographer had frozen the frame, leaving only one person in focus. Alani. She stood by a ridiculously large display of gingerbread houses, her back partially to him. But he knew that silhouette. He had traced it in his sleep for 1,460 nights. The way her shoulders curved, the slight tilt of her head. She was wearing a red wool sweater, the color of vibrant slash against the muted tones of the crowd. It was a color she had always loved, one that made her skin glow like amber. A raw, physical shock coursed through him, so potent it made him grip the cold iron of the railing. His heart, a dormant thing, kicked once, hard, against his ribs. 4 years of silence, for years of wondering, for years of regret, all coalescing into this single, impossible moment. He had built an empire on the foundation of their ruin. After she'd left, taking all the light from his world, he had filled the void with power, with fear, with the cold, hard currency of the soul underworld. He was more respected, more feared, and more empty than he had ever been. He had told himself it was what he was destined for, that a man like him couldn't have a life like that, a love like her. It was a lie he polished daily until it shone like truth. And now, the truth was standing 30 feet below him, a living, breathing refutation of his entire existence. As he watched, paralyzed, she knelt. She was speaking to someone small, someone hidden by the swell of the crowd. A child. A little girl in a matching red winter coat and a red hat with a white pom-pom bounced into view. Alani adjusted the girl's hat, her movements full of a gentle, practiced care that made Ji-hoon's throat tighten. The child looked up at her, and even from this distance, he could see the adoration in her tiny face. A daughter. Of course. Alani had moved on, found someone else, built a life. A real one, filled with warmth and gingerbread houses and little red coats. The thought was a shard of ice in his gut. He should turn around, walk away, disappear back into the sterile silence of his penthouse. It would be the sensible thing to do, the safe thing. But his feet were rooted to the spot, anchored by the gravity of a past he could never escape. The little girl laughed, a sound too distant for him to hear, but one he could feel in the sudden, painful thawing of his chest. Alani stood up, taking the child's small, mittened hand in her own. They started to walk toward the main exit, and the spell was broken. He was moving before he even made a conscious decision to, his body pulled by an invisible string, a cord that had never truly been severed. He descended the escalators 2 steps at a time, his men, ever-present shadows, scrambling to keep pace. He waved them off with a sharp, dismissive gesture. This was not business. This was something else. Something he had no protocol for. The crowd was an obstacle course of strollers and shopping bags. He pushed through, his apologies clipped and unthinking. He could see the back of her red sweater, the little red hat bobbing alongside it. They were nearing the revolving doors. He was running out of time. What would he even say? What could he possibly say after 4 years of letting the silence grow into a continent between them? His mind was a blank slate, wiped clean by the sheer, overwhelming force of her presence. All the carefully constructed walls of his world were crumbling. He saw them pause by the door, Alani kneeling again to speak to the little girl. This was his chance. His last chance. He closed the remaining distance, his footsteps suddenly deafening in his own ears. The scent of her perfume, the same subtle vanilla and sandalwood, hit him first. It was a scent he'd once known better than his own. It gut-punched him with 1,000 memories, of lazy Sunday mornings, of tangled sheets, of her head on his chest. He stopped a few feet behind her. He could see the delicate curl of hair at the nape of her neck. He could see the faint wear on the heel of her boots. Real-life details that made her more tangible, more painfully present than any of his ghosts. He opened his mouth, the name a strange and foreign thing on his tongue. Alani. She froze. Her entire body went rigid, a statue carved from disbelief. For a long moment, she didn't turn, and in that silence, Ji-hoon felt the crushing weight of every day he had let pass without reaching out. Then, slowly, she rose to her feet and turned around. The recognition in her eyes was instant, followed by a wave of something more complex.
Shock. Fear.
A deep, resonant sorrow. Ji-hoon, she breathed, her voice a fragile whisper he almost didn't catch. Her hand instinctively tightened around the little girl's, pulling her closer until the child was partially hidden behind her leg. The girl peered out at him, her eyes wide and curious. They were dark, intelligent eyes. Familiar eyes. He felt a strange jolt, a flicker of recognition he couldn't place. "What are you doing here?" Alani asked, her voice steadier now, laced with a protective edge he knew all too well. It was the same tone she used to use when his world got too close to hers. "I was shopping," he said, the words sounding absurd. He gestured vaguely at the store around them, at the glittering chaos of the holiday season. "You? Here? In Seoul?" His mind raced. He'd had his people keep tabs on her after she left, a discreet, untraceable surveillance. He knew she'd gone back to the States, to Chicago. He'd stopped the reports 2 years ago. It was too painful, a daily reminder of all he had lost. When had she come back?
And why?
Before he could ask, the little girl spoke, her voice clear and high. "Mommy, who is that man?" She pointed a red-mittened finger at him. He looked sad, the observation, so simple and so brutally accurate, struck Ji-hoon with the force of a physical blow. He didn't know how to respond. Alani looked from him to her daughter, her expression softening for a moment before hardening again with resolve. She took a deep, shaky breath. "Ji-hoon," she said, her eyes locking onto his. "We need to talk. There's something you should know." The cafe she chose was small and quiet, tucked away in a side alley, smelling of roasted coffee beans and cinnamon. It was the kind of place they used to love, a world away from the gilded cages he now frequented. His men waited outside, 2 stoic sentinels in black coats, their presence a stark reminder of the chasm between his life and this fragile domestic scene. They sat at a small wooden table in the corner. Alani ordered a hot chocolate for the little girl, whose name he now knew was Somi, and a black coffee for herself. He ordered nothing. He couldn't imagine swallowing. Somi was immediately absorbed in the task of coloring on a paper placemat with a trio of crayons the waitress had provided, her small tongue sticking out in concentration. The silence at the table was thick, heavy with unspoken history. Ji-hoon couldn't stop looking at the child, at the way her dark, curly hair escaped from under her red hat, at the delicate shape of her hands as she gripped a yellow crayon. He was a man who noticed details, who could read a room, a threat, a weakness in an opponent's eyes in seconds. And the details of this child were screaming something at him, a truth his mind was desperately trying to assemble. "She's 5, Alani said, her voice low. She didn't look at him, her gaze fixed on her daughter. The words hung in the air between them. 5. He did the math, his mind a cold, ruthlessly efficient calculator. They had divorced 4 years ago. The split had been abrupt, brutal. He'd come home one day to an empty apartment and a short, sterile note.
No explanation. No goodbye.
Just gone. 4 years ago. The girl was 5. A cold dread, colder than the Seoul winter, began to pool in his stomach. He traced the timeline backward. 5 years ago, they were still together. They had been trying to bridge the ever-widening gap between his life and the one she wanted. 5 years ago was the last time their marriage had felt real, before the shadows had consumed it completely. He finally found his voice. "When did you leave?" he asked, the question rough, torn from his throat. "In March," she replied, still not looking at him.
4 years ago, March.
He remembered. A miserable, rainy month. He had been consumed by a turf war with the Park family, sleeping in his office, coming home smelling of metal and smoke, if he came home at all. He remembered a fight, one of many, but this one had been different. She had begged him to walk away from it all. He had told her it wasn't possible, that this was his life, his legacy. He had chosen his kingdom over his queen. A week later, she was gone. She was born in October, Alani added quietly, as if delivering the final, fatal piece of evidence. October, 7 months after she left. The math was undeniable. The truth was there, sitting across from him, coloring a lopsided sun with a yellow crayon. This was not just any child. This was his child, his daughter. The floor seemed to drop out from under him. The air in his lungs turned to poison. He was a father. He had been a father for 5 years, and he had been living his life as if he had nothing, no one. The regret was a physical entity, a monster with claws that tore at his insides. He looked at Somi, really looked at her this time, searching for a piece of himself. And he found it, in the stubborn set of her small jaw, in the shape of her eyes, his own eyes, staring back at him from her beautiful face. He had spent 4 years mourning the loss of his wife, when he should have been mourning the loss of a life with his child. The muffled sounds of the cafe, the clink of porcelain, the hiss of the espresso machine, faded into a dull roar in his ears. There was only the frantic, unsteady rhythm of his own heart. A storm of emotion unlike anything he had ever known raged inside him. It was a hurricane of regret, a tidal wave of sorrow, and beneath it all, a terrifying, fiercely protective love for this little girl he had only just met. A daughter. The word echoed in the vast, empty chambers of his heart.
Somi.
He tested the name silently. It felt both utterly foreign and profoundly right. Alani was watching him now, her guard up, her expression an agonizing mix of fear and fragile hope. She was waiting for his reaction, for the explosion, the denial, the anger. He could see the tension in her shoulders, the way she held her coffee cup with white-knuckled hands. She had carried this secret alone for 5 years. She had protected their daughter from him, from his world, and he couldn't even blame her. He had given her every reason to. He looked from Alani's worried face to Somi's innocent one. The little girl had abandoned her son and was now meticulously drawing a stick figure with wild, scribbled hair. His stick figure, he realized, was frowning. "Why didn't you tell me?" The words were quiet, devoid of the anger she probably expected. They were just hollow.
Aching.
"Would you have believed me?" she countered, her voice trembling slightly. "Or would you have thought it was a trap? A way to get something from you?" He had no answer because she was right. 4 years ago, he was a man who saw threats and leverage in everything, even love. "I left to protect her, Ji-hoon," she continued, her voice gaining strength. "From that life. From them. From the man you were becoming, the man he had become." The words landed like stones. He finally broke his gaze from them and stared down at his own hands, resting on the table. They were large, calloused, capable of breaking bones and signing death warrants. They were not the hands of a father. He had to be better. He had to be different.
Now.
He looked up, met Alani's eyes, and then shifted his gaze to his daughter. He spoke one sentence, a declaration that changed the axis of his world. "She's mine." It wasn't a question. It was a statement of fact. A claiming. An oath. Alani's carefully constructed composure finally shattered. A single tear traced a path down her cheek, and she nodded, a small, jerky movement. At the sound of his voice, Somi looked up from her masterpiece, her dark eyes curious. "Are you going to stop being sad now?" she asked him, her head cocked to the side. "The picture needs a smile." He insisted on driving them home. The silence in his black Genesis G90 was a living thing, thick and charged with 5 years of unsaid words. Somi was in the back, safely buckled into a booster seat that looked comically out of place against the plush leather. She had fallen asleep almost immediately, her small face peaceful, her red hat askew. Her presence transformed the sterile luxury of the vehicle. The air, usually tinged with the scent of expensive leather and his own cold cologne, now carried the faint, sweet smell of chocolate and crayons. It was the smell of a life he knew nothing about. Alani sat in the passenger seat, staring out at the blurred Christmas lights of the city. She looked exhausted, the adrenaline of their encounter fading into a deep weariness. He wanted to ask her 1,000 questions.
Why Seoul? Why now?
What was her life like? But the words wouldn't form. Instead, he found himself asking the simplest one. Why did you come back? She was quiet for a long time, watching the snow begin to fall in fat, lazy flakes. He's gone, she said finally.
Who?
Chairman Park. I read he had a heart attack a few months ago. His son took over. They said the old ways died with him. Ji-hoon's hands tightened on the steering wheel. Chairman Park had been his most bitter rival, a man of old-school brutality. His death had, ironically, made the streets more dangerous as his volatile son scrambled to consolidate power. Alani had come back thinking the danger had passed, when in reality, it had only changed its face. And, she continued, her voice softer, it felt wrong. For her to grow up not knowing this place. Her other half. Even if she never knew you, the admission hung between them, a fragile bridge over a chasm of pain. He pulled up in front of a modest, older apartment building in a quiet residential neighborhood. It was a different universe from his glass and steel penthouse overlooking the Han River. This was a place where people lived, not just existed. He turned off the engine, and the silence returned, broken only by the soft sound of Somi's breathing. Let me help you, he said, the words feeling clumsy, inadequate. With money, a better place, security. Alani turned to face him, her expression unreadable in the dim light of the dashboard. No, she said, her voice firm. Thank you, but no. I don't want that life for her, Ji-hoon. I don't want your money or your men. I want her to have a normal childhood. That's why I left. That's the one thing I can give her. He watched as she gently unbuckled a sleeping Somi and lifted her into her arms. He got out and opened the door for her, an unfamiliar, chivalrous gesture. He walked them to the entrance of the building, the snow dusting their shoulders. Through the glass doors, he could see a lobby decorated with handmade paper chains and children's drawings of Santa Claus. It was a home. He felt a pang of longing so sharp it almost buckled his knees. He was a king in an empty castle, and she had built a life, a real, warm, loving life, without him. A few days passed in a haze of unreality. Ji-hoon moved through his life like a ghost, the brutal mechanics of his business feeling distant and absurd. His lieutenants noticed the change. The cold, calculating focus in his eyes had been replaced by something else, something they couldn't name. He had his people run a new, comprehensive, and completely invisible surveillance on Alani and Somi. He learned that Alani was teaching English at a private academy nearby. He learned that Somi loved the swings at the local park and had a passion for strawberry-flavored milk. These small, domestic details were like jewels, precious and rare, and he hoarded them. He decided to see them. He didn't call. He knew Alani might say no, might still be too scared. He bought a gift for Somi, a beautifully illustrated book of Korean folk tales. It felt more appropriate than the mountain of expensive toys he had initially considered. He was learning. He drove himself, dismissing his driver, needing the solitude to calm the frantic beating of his heart. As he turned onto their street, a familiar black sedan parked halfway down the block caught his eye. It was nondescript, but he knew the model, knew the slight tint of the windows. Park's men. A cold, paralyzing dread washed over him. They knew. They had somehow tracked Alani to Seoul. Or worse, they had found her through him. His world was bleeding into theirs. This was Alani's worst fear made manifest, and it was his fault. His first instinct was primal. To get out of the car, to drag them from theirs, to end the threat with the swift, brutal efficiency he was known for. But he stopped himself. That was the old way. That was the violence Alani had run from. It would only terrify her and Somi and prove he hadn't changed at all. He couldn't be a monster in front of his daughter's home. He reversed slowly, pulling into an alley where he could watch unseen. He took out his phone, his fingers steady despite the rage coursing through him. He dialed his second-in-command, Lee. "There is a black Hyundai Sonata, license plate 73 Go, 4819 on Alani Street," he said, his voice pure ice. "I want it gone. I want the men inside it to vanish.
No nois. No trace.
No one ever finds them. Do you understand me?" "Yes, sir," Lee replied, the professional calm in his voice a stark contrast to the storm in Ji-hoon's chest. "Consider it handled," he hung up. This was the new way. He would use the power and darkness at his command not for gain or for territory, but as a shield. He would become a silent, invisible wall around them, and he would let nothing through. Protecting them was now his only purpose. It was the only mission that mattered. He waited a day, giving Lee's men time to do their work, before he went to see her. He found them at the park he now knew Somi loved. It was late afternoon, and the winter sun was casting long, golden shadows across the snow. Somi, a tiny bundle of red against the white landscape, was on the swings, laughing as Alani pushed her higher and higher. Jihoon stood at the edge of the playground for a long time, just watching them. This small, perfect circle of warmth. He felt like an intruder, a creature of the night stumbling into the daylight. Finally, he took a breath and walked toward them. Alani saw him first. Her smile faltered, and she stopped pushing the swing. Somi, however, broke into a wide grin. "Sad man," she yelled with the unfiltered honesty of a 5-year-old. "You came back." Alani shushed her gently, a faint blush on her cheeks. "Somi, that's not his name." "What is it then?" Somi asked, her swing slowing to a gentle arc. Alani looked at him, a question in her eyes. "My name is Jihoon," he said, his voice softer than he intended. To Somi, he added, "It's very nice to see you again." He held out the gift-wrapped book. "This is for you." Somi looked to her mother for permission. Alani hesitated for a fraction of a second before giving a small nod. Somi scrambled off the swing and took the book with a serious expression, carefully tearing at the paper. As she became absorbed in the colorful pages, Jihoon turned to Alani. "I need to tell you something," he said, his gaze unwavering. "I understand now. Why you left.
Why you didn't tell me?
You were right to do it." Her surprise was evident. She had likely been steeling herself for a fight, for demands and ultimatums. "I was a king in an empty castle," he went on, the words tasting like ash. "I had everything, and I had nothing. I didn't see it then. But I see it now." He looked over at their daughter, who was tracing the image of a dragon with her little finger. A wave of profound love, so fierce it was painful, washed over him. He looked back at Alani. "I will not let that world touch her," he said, his voice low and intense. "Or you. I swear it. I'm not going anywhere." It wasn't a grand, romantic declaration. It was a promise. A simple, powerful, unbreakable vow. He saw the last of her defenses crumble. The fear in her eyes was replaced by a tentative, fragile trust. The spark between them, the one he thought had been extinguished 4 years ago, flickered back to life. It wasn't the wild, passionate fire of their youth. It was something quieter, deeper. A warm, steady flame against the encroaching darkness. In the weeks that followed, Jihoon began the slow, arduous process of untangling himself from the life he had built. It was like trying to dismantle a skyscraper from the inside without anyone noticing. He delegated meetings, rerouted illicit shipments to trusted lieutenants, and began to systematically withdraw from the day-to-day operations. He started to build a firewall between Kwon Jihoon, the businessman, and Jihoon, the father. His real work now took place in stolen hours. He spent afternoons at the park, learning the precise height Somi liked to be pushed on the swings. He learned that her favorite color was not red, as her coat suggested, but a very specific shade of sunny yellow. He learned that she hated pickles with a violent passion and that she firmly believed her stuffed rabbit, Detective Hops, was a real investigator on a secret mission. These were the details that mattered. They were the bricks and mortar of a life he was desperately trying to build. One evening, he was at their apartment. Alani had hesitantly invited him for dinner, and he had accepted so fast he was afraid he sounded desperate. He sat on the floor of her small, warm living room, surrounded by a chaotic explosion of Lego bricks, trying to follow Somi's very specific instructions for building a princess castle. "No, not there," she commanded, pointing a small finger. "The sparkly tower goes on top. It's for the dragon to sleep." "Of course," he said with a seriousness that matched her own. "My mistake." His phone buzzed in his pocket, a distinct vibration he had set for Lee. "A problem."
Urgent.
His old instincts screamed at him to answer it, to take control, to handle the threat. He looked at Somi's focused face, at the Lego tower in his hand, at Alani watching them from the kitchen doorway with a soft, hesitant smile. He reached into his pocket, pulled out the phone and pressed the button to silence the call without even looking at the screen. He tossed it onto the couch. It could wait. All of it could wait. Alani's smile widened. She didn't say anything, but he saw the understanding in her eyes. It was a small action, a simple choice, but it was everything. He was choosing them. He was choosing this small, bright room over his dark, sprawling empire. He was choosing to build a Lego castle for a princess and her dragon. Later that night, after Somi was asleep, he and Alani sat in the quiet living room, nursing cups of tea. She asks about you, Alani said softly. She wants to know if you're her father. What do you tell her? He asked, his heart clenching. I tell her you're a friend of Mommy's. A special friend. She looked at him, her vulnerability a quiet offering. I don't know what else to say, Ji-hoon. Tell her the truth, he said, meeting her gaze. Tell her I am her father. And I'm not going to be sad anymore. Christmas morning arrived, not with a flurry of activity, but with a quiet, sacred hush. Ji-hoon hadn't gone back to his penthouse. He had fallen asleep on Alani's couch, a worn but comfortable quilt pulled over him. He awoke not to an alarm, but to the sound of soft giggling. He opened his eyes to see Somi standing a few feet away, her eyes wide with excitement, a finger pressed to her lips. The living room was bathed in the warm, multicolored glow of the small Christmas tree in the corner. It was a real tree, slightly lopsided, decorated with handmade ornaments and strings of popcorn. It was the most beautiful thing he had ever seen. He came, Somi whispered, pointing a shaky finger at the few presents under the tree. He sat up, the quilt falling away, and smiled. He did. Alani appeared in the doorway from the kitchen, a mug of coffee in her hands, a real, unguarded smile on her face. Merry Christmas, Ji-hoon. Merry Christmas, he replied, and the words felt real for the first time in years. They watched as Somi carefully opened her gifts. She squealed with delight at the partner he'd found for Detective Hops, a small, plush bear wearing a tiny trench coat and fedora. Inspector Paddington, she declared. Now they can solve crimes together. She hugged the bear tightly, then ran over and, to his utter shock, threw her small arms around his neck in a fierce, clumsy hug. Thank you, Appa, she whispered into his shoulder. Father. The Korean word, so simple, so powerful, cracked something open inside his chest. He hugged her back, his eyes stinging. He looked over her head at Alani, who was watching them with tears shining in her eyes. Later, after the excitement had settled, he and Alani stood by the window, watching the snow fall on the quiet street below. Somi was on the floor, introducing her two detectives to the residents of the Lego castle. I never stopped, he said quietly, not needing to explain what he meant. Even when I thought I had, even in the silence. I never stopped loving you. Alani leaned her head against his shoulder, her warmth seeping into him. I know, she whispered. I think I ran because I was scared I would never stop either. And I couldn't love you and protect her at the same time. You won't have to anymore, he promised. There were no grand gestures, no diamond necklaces in velvet boxes. There was just this. The quiet hum of a radiator, the scent of coffee and pine needles, the sound of their daughter narrating a story about a rabbit and a bear, and the steady, comforting weight of the woman he loved beside him. His kingdom was no longer an empire of shadows. It was this small, warm apartment, bathed in the gentle light of a Christmas morning. The future was still an unwritten page, the dangers of his past not entirely gone, but for the first time, he wasn't afraid. He was home.